about free expression for a little bit. We're going to start with the notion that's kind of at the heart of our understandings of free expression, and that is prior restraint. Because, of course, the First Amendment to the Constitution says that Congress will make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and there's some other parts to that as well that aren't quite as relevant to what we're going to be talking about. So it seems like if you just flatly read the First Amendment to the Constitution, that we wouldn't be having this discussion, because it literally says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And so you would think that that is pretty determinative. But, we still have this history of government attempts to limit expression. And that history goes back a very long time. I'll talk about one of the very earliest examples of it a little bit later. But it goes back to well before the founding of the Republic. It goes back to colonial times and even sort of proto-colonial times, where the government was doing things to limit expression. And even after the Constitution was ratified and we had the First Amendment, which seemed pretty decisive, we still have had a lot of these attempts to limit expression. So, what exactly is it that the First Amendment protects us from, if it's not all attempts at government to restrain our speech? And the answer to that in the words of the Supreme Court over the years, is that the First Amendment most clearly prevents what is called prior restraint. And prior restraint is when the government tries to censor something before that expression actually takes place. That's why it's called prior restraint. That the government says, all right, we want to ban speech, or we want to ban a certain kind of film, or a certain kind of artistic image, or perhaps, expressive practices on the internet. And how do we do that? And they want to do it before you've actually got a piece of expression to ban. So, for example, if the government wanted to, ban, images of naked people in movies, they would be doing that if they were trying to pass a law to that effect. They would be doing that without actually looking at a particular film. They're not saying, oh, this movie particularly should not be allowed. They're saying a whole category of speech, or perhaps a class of speech, should not be allowed. And that is what prior restraint is. It's banning speech or other kinds of expression before there is an example that you can ban in specific. So instead of saying one particular movie ought to get banned, you're trying to ban a particular kind of practice. And the Supreme Court has consistently said that prior restraint is not allowed under the Constitution, and there are reasons for that. So, what are those reasons? Well, the first reason is that if you ban something before you even have an example of speech to protest against, then that ban takes whatever idea you're trying to ban completely out of the marketplace of ideas. We can no longer discuss the subject that you have banned any expression of. And there's a good example of this. It's not really a First Amendment example, but it is an example of taking things out of the marketplace of ideas. So, when I was younger, there was this TV station called MTV. And believe it or not, they actually played music videos. That was the point of the show, of the whole channel. And, there was an explosion of music that was getting on MTV. And MTV started coming out with this policy that said that there were a number of things you could not talk about on MTV. And if you had some of these things in your music video, they wouldn't even bleep them out. They would just silence the part where you said anything. And one of the things they said that you couldn't say in a video on MTV is you could not reference drugs in any way. Any sort of illegal drug use was not allowable on MTV. And that's an example of the kind of policy that the First Amendment protects us from if the government was doing it, right? But here's the problem with that. For example, that rule would ban us from saying the word pot. There were a bunch of songs that had different, references to marijuana. But if I wanted to create, let's say, some sort of, dance song where the only words were "don't smoke pot," then MTV's policy prevents me from doing that. All you'd ever hear on my song is "don't smoke pot," "don't smoke pot," and I wouldn't be able to discuss it. And not only that, if you look at that sort of notion, particularly when it comes to marijuana, over the years we've had a change in the way that people think of that particular drug. There's a kind of growing trend towards legalization of marijuana nationally. And it might have taken less time had we been more allowed to discuss this in the public, if we could have actually, had a back and forth discussion. And the problem with prior restraint is it prevents that from occurring. When the government does it, you never get to talk about the thing, because before you even use the expression, you are, already preemptively banned from ever doing anything with that expression. So it's a bad idea because it prevents the kind of back and forth discussion that we believe is at the heart of a democracy. Secondly, prior restraint laws tend to censor more materials than their authors intend, right? Like, a great example of this basically is any time you try to get rid of a specific kind of expression, you end up banning more than you meant. And so let me give you an example of that. Periodically, people want to stop us from flag burning. And, there are some folks that are very committed to the notion that the flag is a unique and important symbol in American life. And while it is very, very, very rare that anyone actually ever burns a flag, there are folks that think that we ought to change the Constitution so that we can ban flag burning. And there's a number of problems with this, and I won't go into the whole debate. But, just as an example, the U.S. Code, U.S. federal law, says that if you have an official American flag, you are not allowed to destroy that flag if it becomes tattered or otherwise worn and it's no longer good for its original job. You're only allowed to destroy that flag by burning it. You're not allowed to shred it or do anything else because those things are considered inconsiderate. But imagine like we did have a law that said you're not allowed to burn the flag. And let's imagine further that it's the 4th of July and you buy a newspaper. And on the 4th of July, predictably, there's a bunch of ads that have the American flag on them and say, come to our 4th of July sale at the furniture store, or come to our 4th of July sale at the clothing store, or whatever. So you've got this newspaper and it has a bunch of pictures of the American flag on it. And you decide that you want to start a backyard barbecue, and you have one of those chimneys that lights the coals for you. And the way that you do that is you put newspaper in the bottom of the chimney and you light it and it lights your coals. Well, you are burning the American flag. And does that mean the constitutional amendment outlaws you using newspapers that have flag ads to start your barbecue? Does it mean that, and the answer is generally speaking, yes. We have a really hard time writing these sorts of laws that only target the speech we want and always target stuff that we don't want, and we end up banning a bunch of expression that's entirely legitimate expression in our attempts to stop what we view as illegitimate expression. And finally, prior restraint has what's called a chilling effect. And what that means is that if there are penalties, if there are legal penalties against a certain kind of expression, then anyone that might be involved in that expression doesn't just stop themselves from doing or saying whatever it is that's been banned. They really want to avoid the penalty. So let's say we passed a law that said if you burn the flag, then you go to jail for 10 years. I would be highly motivated to never break that law because I'm not about to go to jail. So I would never even do anything involving an American flag. In fact, I predict that if we were to have such a law, that the number of artists who would be willing to depict the American flag in some way would dramatically go down, because they would not want to risk in any way the possibility that they would even by accident burn the flag. And so you'd end up in a situation where no one's drawing the flag anymore, no one's painting the flag anymore, because they don't want to get anywhere near the 10-year sentence, right? And that's the chilling effect that we talk about. People self-censor. And when they self-censor, they go way beyond the original intent of the law because they're so highly motivated to avoid the penalty. All right, let's talk about a couple court cases involved with this. Neer versus Minnesota is widely regarded as the court's first great press case. And what happened in Neer versus Minnesota is that there was a newspaper that had accused a local politician of corruption. And they were pretty specific in talking about what this local politician had done. And the politician sued them and made the argument that the material that the newspaper was about to publish about that politician was scandalous and defamatory. Just imagine the whole Donald Trump tape thing. You could say, well, Trump's language on that tape is scandalous, and it certainly does defame his reputation. And so the argument that this original politician made many years ago in Neer versus Minnesota is that the newspaper should not be allowed to publish these things because they were defamatory and they were scandalous. And the court actually ruled that, in fact, the newspaper could go ahead and publish the scandalous and defamatory material. But in the course of this court case, the court left open the possibility that it might be okay for the government to engage in prior restraint in extreme circumstances. Basically what happened was the politician in question claimed that the government, and the state of Minnesota ultimately got on the side of the politician, claimed that this should never be allowed to be published, and they did a very bad job of explaining why. They basically said, newspapers don't have the right to publish scandalous and defamatory material. And they didn't do a good job of sort of making that argument. And so the court said, look, in this particular instance, the paper gets to be published. But we can imagine a future situation in which it might be okay for the government to censor this kind of expression. And so while it was a very important court case, Neer versus Minnesota certainly didn't close the door on challenges to freedom of expression. Which leaves us with the Pentagon Papers, which is not actually the name of the court case. It's actually New York Times Company versus United States. And if you read enough free expression stuff, you'll eventually encounter the New York Times over and over and over again because they are they're so heavily involved in pushing the envelope of free speech. So in this particular incident, what happened was the New York Times got a hold of a previously classified document that analyzed the sort of military defense posture of the United States and the history of the United States defense procedures for the last, 20 years, let's say. And they were going to go ahead and publish that, or at least publish selections of that classified material. And the court said the government cannot stop newspapers from publishing classified material if they have it. The newspapers don't necessarily have the right to obtain classified material, but if they do happen to obtain that material in some fashion, they are allowed to publish it. Now, again, this seems like a pretty strong stance by the court in favor of free expression, but this particular case left open the possibility that prior restraint could be justifiable. And again, the government sort of failed to make a good case about why, as a matter of course, the newspaper should never be allowed to publish classified material. In essence, the government said, it's classified, they shouldn't have access to it, therefore they shouldn't get to publish it. And the court disagreed and said, while it is maybe true that they shouldn't have access to it, they did get access to it, someone gave it to them, and in that circumstance they're allowed to publish it. But again, the court said, we can imagine a situation in the future in which prior restraint might be justified. That brings us to the Progressive Magazine case. And the Progressive Magazine case is fascinating because it's one of those situations that almost sounds like a scenario in a television thriller show like 24. And so you say, well, what are newspapers not allowed to publish? If they can publish classified material, if they can publish scandalous and defamatory stuff, why are they not, what aren't they allowed to publish? And, someone eventually goes, what if the newspaper was going to publish how to build an atomic bomb? Then you would definitely stop them, right? And the answer to that question turns out to be no, because in United States versus Progressive Incorporated, which is the real name of the Progressive Magazine case, the government was trying to stop the Progressive from publishing an article that contained classified information about how nuclear bombs work. In essence, the Progressive Magazine was about to publish a kind of article on how to build a nuclear device. And you would think that would be a moment where the court would say, okay, this is the place where you're not allowed to publish, classified material is, in this particular instance, is classified for a reason. And there was an ongoing court case, and we will never know what the outcome of that court case was, because while they were involved in the court case, a couple of other publications went out and published that article. And what they did was they proved that they did not need the classified material that the Progressive had in order to write the article. Because the material that the Progressive had was a document that had been classified. But the information in that document was widely available in other places. If you just went to a good university library and looked up a bunch of science books, you'd be able to construct the same material that the Progressive Magazine had gotten directly from an anonymous source that was already classified. And so while they were waiting, other publications went ahead and published this material about nuclear weapons, proving that classified information was not that important, and the federal government gave up on that particular attempt to get rid of an impending piece of publication. The government dropped the suit, right? And it turned out not to be an issue. But again, I don't think we've necessarily had a great First Amendment ruling on this particular instance. The history of First Amendment law as it relates to national security is a complicated history. But in this particular instance, we did not get a ruling because the government dropped the lawsuit. It knew it couldn't win when the same article they were trying to halt from publication had already been printed in several other sources. All right. That brings us to obscenity, which is one of the most common ways that people have in the course of history tried to get rid of free expression. And this history is very long. In fact, one of the very first documented efforts by a colonial government in North America to ban something was a colonial government that was trying to ban the circulation and the publication of this anti-Catholic pamphlet. And that seems really odd, right? Because you'd think, well, that's a religious discrimination issue. But actually, the pamphlet in question made the ridiculous argument that Catholics were bad because monasteries and nunneries were just nonstop orgies of sex between the priests and the nuns, which is the most silly thing I can think of off the top of my head. But nevertheless, this particular pamphlet made that argument in graphic detail. Oh, here's what the priests and the nuns are doing, and then they did this, and and it makes some ridiculous claims about satanic worship and stuff like that. But it was very sexually graphic, and so that was a very early attempt by the governments to ban things for obscenity. So the history of attempts to ban things for obscenity substantially predates the formation of our existing government. So that begs the question of what is obscene. If you're trying to ban stuff for obscenity, we need to know what obscenity is. And here's where we get your SAT word for the day. If you look back in history, most of the common definitions of the word obscene involved the word prurient, which is a difficult word to pronounce. It is prurient, or prurient, right? So you end up trying to say other words all the time because your mouth doesn't want to say that, but prurient. And prurient means marked by, arousing, or appealing to sexual desire. To say something is prurient is basically to say that that thing is trying to make you sexually aroused. And so, you can actually drop that in an everyday conversation if you'd like. You could be like, wow, I like the way that dress looks on you. It's positively prurient. So then people will stop and ask you what the heck you're talking about. But anyway, that's what that word means. And it is a word that commonly historically was used to define obscenity, which means, if you think about it, that for almost its entire history, the word obscene largely meant sexual and not anything else. But just saying something is sexual or that it arouses sexual desire wasn't the sort of end of that discussion. There's a much more complicated discussion to be had about what actually is obscene, even if it has something to do with arousing sexual desire. So finally, in 1973, there was a court case called Miller versus California. And that court case basically established the modern definition of obscenity that, with some slight tinkering here and there, is still the definition of obscenity which we have today. So it's been pretty stable over the past 40 or so years. Here's that definition. In order for something to be obscene, first of all, the average person applying community standards has to find the material prurient. So whatever it is that the government's trying to ban, the court has to rule that an average person would find that material something that attempts to arouse sexual desire, and that average person would have to do so using community standards, not their own personal standards. And if you read this, you can kind of tell there's a problem with it already. I don't know what an average person is. I'm not sure there is such a creature. But if there is, it would be interesting also to see sort of like what is the notion of a community standard, right? Does the notion of what arouses sexual desire differ from, community to community in Atlanta, or perhaps from, city to city in the state, or state to state in the United States? I don't know. And if it did, I have no idea how we'd know that. I've lived in a number of different places across the United States, and in none of those places did I ever get a welcome packet from the local community going, hey, this is what we think is sexually arousing around here. And if I had, I would have thought it was some kind of joke. So it's a weird first standard, but the first thing we have to establish is that whatever it is attempting to arouse sexual desire. Secondly, the material must depict that sexual conduct in a patently offensive way. And patently in this instance means unquestionably, inarguably offensive. So we have to have something that's arousing sexual desire, and it has to be inarguably offensive. It's a very difficult thing to prove. Again, like what counts as is offensive to me may be very different than what counts as offensive to you. And again, it's difficult to imagine how the court determines what is in fact patently offensive. But anyway, so now we've got two of our three parts of the definition of obscenity. For something to be obscene, it has to arouse sexual desire, and it has to do so in a way that is inarguably offensive. And third, the material must lack any value. It cannot have value of any kind. If it is valuable in any way, then it is automatically not obscene. So if it is educational, it is not obscene. If it is political, it is not obscene. If it's art, it's not obscene. And anything else that you can think of that might be a legitimate source of value for a kind of expression, it is not obscene. And there have been court cases in which things that seem kind of at face value to be obscene have later been ruled not to be obscene because of this particular requirement. A good example of this is there was a punk band called the Dead Kennedys. And the punk band released an album called Frankenchrist. And in that album, they included a reproduction of a painting. And the painting was nothing but rows of male and female genitalia having sex. Disembodied genitals having sex. And I've seen this thing, actually, as a result of some free expression research I did back when I was in college. And it's really strikingly graphic. And so someone arrested the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, a guy named Jello Biafra, and put him in jail for distributing obscenity to minors. And he eventually got out of jail on the argument that that painting had artistic value, that it was art. And in court, his defense of this argument was that you could tell that that painting was art because it was painted by an artist. And in fact, it was painted by an internationally recognized artist named H.R. Giger, who actually also drew he created the Alien for the Aliens movies franchises that they're about to do more of. So he had a tendency to paint and draw really, graphic and disturbing imagery. And eventually, Jello Biafra got let out of jail because the court concluded that it was art that he had been distributing and not obscenity because it was painted by an artist. So anything that has any kind of value of that nature is not obscenity. So it has to meet all three of these standards to be obscene. It has to be prurient, it has to be offensive, and it cannot have value. And so as a result of that, it's very, very difficult to prove that anything is obscene these days. And standards of what counts as obscenity can vary a lot from community to community. But even in that instance, it's extraordinarily difficult to ban something for obscenity or to punish someone for distributing things that are obscene, because it has to meet all these requirements that are so sort of challenging for anyone to prove. Now, the court has since ruled that child pornography is not protected by this law or by this standard, and it's most importantly because, not necessarily because the child pornography, meets one of the, or fails to meet one of the aspects of the Miller standard, but because having sex with minors is illegal anyway. And so the documentation that you have of that kind of expression is, in fact, documentation of a crime. So whoever it is that's having sex with kids on your, one assumes pictures or videos that people distribute for this sort of thing, they were committing a crime. And so your ability to document that crime is, in fact, not protected. And the courts also ruled that we have a special obligation to protect children in this particular instance. Some localities use other tactics to enforce anti-obscenity laws, so there will be laws sometimes in different places that seem odd, and those laws are often just another way to get at this question without using the traditional concept of obscenity. All right, a couple more things I want to talk about that are about freedom of expression, and this one is one that's really kind of a pet peeve of mine. In 1949, Congress enacted what was called the Fairness Doctrine, and that doctrine required television stations, this is television we're talking about, to air all sides of public issues. So if a television station, a news program, aired a particular perspective on an issue, they would be forced to bring someone on to talk about the other perspectives on that issue, because it was thought that this was necessary for people to have access to quality television. Now, as we'll find out the next lecture that I give, 1949 was an important moment for television because the growth period of television had really begun in earnest in 1949, but we were in a situation where very few people in the United States had access to more than one television station. So if you were living in an area, the great likelihood is that you only had one TV station that you could get, and that was the only source of your television news. And so Congress was justifiably concerned that if you lived in an area whose television station was very politically biased, then that would substantially degrade your chances of getting good quality information from your television, unless the station were legally required to be fair. That was the Fairness Doctrine. Now, that doctrine actually went away in 1987. In 1987, we rescinded the law because there were so many television stations in America, and because cable had started to arrive, which again is something I'll talk about in my next lecture. And that kind of ensured that we weren't going to have a situation where people only had access to one very politically biased television station. That it was increasingly impossible to imagine a situation where people literally only had access to one television station. And so there was much greater likelihood of competition and therefore diversity of content. So we no longer have a fairness doctrine. And periodically you will hear people, particularly people on talk radio of various stripes, make the argument that the law is being violated because no one's following the fairness doctrine. Well, I'm sorry, but the fairness doctrine doesn't exist anymore. The other thing that happens is people get the fairness doctrine confused with Section 315 of the 1934 Communications Act. And that section actually requires broadcast stations, which means not necessarily cable news, but ABC, NBC, CBS, any stations that are broadcast stations. It requires them to give or sell time to one. If they give or sell time to one candidate, they have to provide equal opportunity for the other candidates. So let me explain how this works. If a station sells ad time to one candidate, it can't refuse to sell time to the others. In other words, if you sell ads to Donald Trump, you must also sell ads to Hillary Clinton and Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, right? So you can't sell ad time to one and not the other. And if you give free time to one candidate, you also have to give free time to the others. If NBC decides they're going to give an hour to Hillary Clinton just to talk about her campaign, they must also give an hour to Donald Trump. They must also give an hour to Jill Stein, and they must also give an hour to Gary Johnson. Which is, by the way, why you don't see that. You just don't see television stations doing that, and they used to. There were periods of time where stations would give time to a candidate to talk about something, and that is very unusual these days because of this particular requirement. Now, the one exemption of this is news programs. So news programs that spend time on one candidate don't have to spend time on another because we assume that the point of journalism is to tell us what's newsworthy, and we realize that not all candidates are equally newsworthy in any particular situation. So that the part of the Communications Act that requires fairness in terms of that stuff is not applicable to news programs. Now, the news programs still have to have ads for both candidates or for all the candidates, but they don't have to give free time because that's way too easy for people to misinterpret.